The Judicial Murder of Mary E. Surratt, by David Miller DeWitt. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Part II. The Vindication. Chapter IV. The Trial of Joseph Holt. On the threshold of his vindication, General Holt revives the discredited and apparently forgotten declaration made by Mr. Pierrepont on the trial of John H. Surratt, and stakes his whole case upon the establishment of the truth of the allegation that the petition for commutation, attached as it was to the record of the findings and sentences of the Military Commission, was the subject of consideration at a meeting of the Cabinet of President Johnson, and its prayer rejected with the concurrence of the members present at such meeting. So long as the contention is limited to what took place during that momentous hour between the President and himself alone, with the light thrown upon it by the record including the endorsed death warrant and the affixed paper, he exhibits a certain lack of confidence in the strength of his defense. For although he prints the circumstantial evidence, as he calls it, to sustain his own version of the confidential interview, consisting of the two letters from his former clerk, heretofore alluded to, and the letter from General Mussey, saying that the acting President told him of the recommendation about that time, he confesses it was not until he recently had secured certain testimony that the petition had been considered by the officers of the Cabinet that he had at length felt his case strong enough to warrant a public challenge of his adversary, and himself justified in submitting it to the public. In short, we have a sort of reversal of the position of 6 years before. Then, after having at first put forward the assertion that the petition was considered by the Cabinet, the Judge Advocate summarily suppresses that branch of his case, and puts into the foreground the explicit asseveration of the identical paper being right before the President's eyes, when he signed the death warrant. He wants no misunderstanding about that. Now, while he keeps in mind, it is true, this version of the confidential interview, he relegates it to the rear, and constitutes the Cabinet consideration the very citadel of his cause. As to what takes place at a meeting of the Cabinet, its members, of course, are the first if not the only witnesses, and it is a matter of surprise that General Holt, so far as is apparent, never, in all these past years, applied to any one of them to substantiate so essential a part of his vindication. He states that he has always been satisfied that the matter must have been considered in the Cabinet, and adds that, from the confidential character of Cabinet deliberations, he has thus far been denied access to this source of information. But he does not say when or to whom he applied for such access, or how he had been denied. It is certain, from what he says elsewhere, that he never applied to Stanton or to Seward. He admits in a subsequent communication that he never applied to McCulloch, Wells, or Dennison, and from the tenor of their letters, now in reply to his, it appears he never applied before to Harlan or to Speed. And these are all members of the Cabinet of President Johnson in July, 1865. Moreover, he does not, even now, in 1873, make application in the first instance to an ex-Cabinet officer. His first application is made to John A. Bingham, his old colleague in the prosecution of Mrs. Surratt, for Cabinet information in the shape of conversations with the two ministers who, after so many years of unsolicited silence in life, are now silent, beyond the reach of solicitation, in death. And it is not until he has secured the desired information, which he would have us believe was entirely unexpected, that he is stirred up to the necessity of a public vindication of his character. And then he selects the two of the surviving ministers of the Cabinet, known to be hostile to the ex-President, as the objects of solicitation, sending them, as a spur to their recollections, the letter containing the reminiscences of his serviceable ally. But by some fatality, the industrious inquirer takes nothing by his somewhat complicated maneuver. The letters he produces from Cabinet officers afford him no assistance. Judge Harlan can recall only an informal discussion by 3 or 4 members of the Cabinet, Seward, Stanton, himself, and probably Speed, of the question of the commutation of the sentence of Mrs. Surratt because of her sex, which, she being the one woman under condemnation, would surely arise in a tribunal of gentlemen, whether there was a recommendation or not, as in fact it did, even among the stern soldiers of the Military Commission. But the writer, who as Senator from the State of Iowa had voted for the conviction of President Johnson, makes the positive declaration that "no part of the record of the trial, the decision of the Court, or the recommendation of clemency was at that time, or ever at any time, read in my (his) presence." He remembers, with undoubting distinctness, inquiring at the time whether the Attorney General had examined the record, and was told that the whole case had been carefully examined by the Attorney General and the Secretary of War, and he states that the question was never submitted to the Cabinet for a formal vote. This letter is most significant, both for what it says and for what it refrains from saying. Its positive statement annihilates the story of a full Cabinet when the vote of every member was adverse, and indeed of any Cabinet meeting whatever, where the paper was present and considered. Such a story as Judge Pierrepont first gathered from the voice of Holt, and the absence of all affirmation that the writer had either seen or heard of the recommendation, while he expressly states that it was never read in his presence, considering the occasion and object of the letter and the bias of the ex Senator, warrants the conclusion that such a document was not mentioned at the informal Cabinet consultation he describes. In any view, the letter furnishes no support to Holt's contention. The writer expressly negatives the presence of the record and the paper, and he does not affirm that such a petition was alluded to, in terms, in the discussion, in the presence of the President, which he surely would have done, in aid of his sorely tried friend, if such had been the fact. The Judge Advocate fares even worse at the hands of the ex Attorney General. Here is a man who knew, if any other member of the Cabinet except Stanton knew, whether the paper in question ever came up for discussion before the President in his Cabinet. He goes so far as to say that after the readings and before the execution, he saw the paper attached to the record "in the President's office," a statement which reminds us of another of the same elusive and evasive character, that the paper was "before the President," and like that affirms nothing, one way or the other, as to the consciousness of the President of its presence. And then he proceeds as follows: "I do not feel at liberty to speak of what was said at Cabinet meetings. In this I know I differ from other gentlemen," presumably an allusion to the Seward and Stanton of Bingham's letter, "but feel constrained to follow my own sense of propriety." His friend's necessity would have been met by something less than a repetition of what was said at Cabinet meetings. He had only to tell whether he saw a certain paper, not in the President's office, but at a meeting of the President and his advisers, or knew of the recognition there of its mere existence, a revelation which would not have violated the most punctilious sense of official propriety, and he feels constrained to withhold the least ray of light upon so simple a question. The witness declines to answer. 10 years after the present controversy, Judge Holt, feeling acutely this weak point in his vindication, again appeals to Speed, in the most moving tones, to break his unaccountable silence, and rescue his friend's gray head from the atrocious accusation, known to him to be false in its every intendment, with which that perfidious monster, dead now 8 years, and, as Holt significantly quotes, gone to his own place, sought "to blacken the reputation of a subordinate officer holding a confidential interview with him." And, strange to say, Speed first neglects even to reply to Holt's repeated communications for 6 months, and then just opens his lips to whisper, "I cannot say more than I have said." He had offered in private, if we may credit Holt, to write a letter to his aggrieved friend, giving him the desired information, but not to be used until after Holt's death, a proposition quite naturally discouraged by Holt, who made this sensible reply: that a letter thus strangely withheld from the public would not, when it appeared, be credited. But, when repeatedly implored to spread the desired information before the public, he again declines to answer. James Speed would not tell the truth, when by telling the truth he might relieve his old friend, in the closing hours of his life, from a most damnable calumny, because, forsooth, of his sense of propriety. he could not violate the secrecy of a Cabinet meeting held nearly 20 years before, a secrecy which he had good reason to believe had already been broken, in the professed interest of truth, by 3 of his own colleagues, and in the alleged interest of a most foul falsehood, by the President himself. Before the Judge finally gives up his old associate as hopeless, he craftily points out to him a way by which the ex Cabinet officer may give his testimony without violating the most punctilious sense of propriety; not only, but without departing one iota from the literal truth. Since his first letter, General Holt informs him: "I have learned that although you gained the information while a member of the Cabinet, it was not strictly in your capacity as such, but that at that moment I laid before the President the record of the trial, with the recommendation for clemency on behalf of Mrs. Surratt. You chanced to be so situated as to be assured by the evidence of your own senses that such petition of recommendation was by me presented to the President, and was the subject of conversation between him and myself." Does this mean that Speed was an unseen spectator of the confidential interview, and witnessed the writing of the death warrant? At all events, for some reason, the ex Attorney General was afraid to accept this opportunity to equivocate. Holt may well wonder at Speed's obstinate silence. He exclaims: "It is a mystery to me." It will be a mystery to every one, provided the black charge was false. But on the hypothesis that the charge was true, that the paper was suppressed, either actually or virtually, there is no mystery. Had Speed known that the paper was not only before the President, but considered by him either in or out of the Cabinet, it is beyond the limit of human credulity to believe, for a moment, that with all possible motives to lead him to succor his friend, and with none to lead him to shield the character of his dead political foe, he would not have uttered the one decisive word in the controversy. And he comes as near doing so as he dares, evidently. He shows, in 1873, a yearning to help his old friend; a yearning so strong that we may be sure it was not the frivolous pretext of official propriety which constrained him, then, much less in 1883. If he, too, as Holt said of Stanton, feared the resentment of the dethroned Johnson in life, he certainly could not have feared the resentment of Johnson's ghost after death. He must be numbered among those who, with arms encumbered thus, or this head shake, or by pronouncing of some doubtful phrase, as "well, well, we know," or "we could an if we would," or "if we list to speak," or "there be an if they might," ambiguously give out to know what they are sworn never to speak of. If there was any oath guarding fellow in the cellarage, rest assured it was not the pale wraith of the hoodwinked Johnson, but the blood boltered spectre of his once wide ruling Minister of War. Amid such a dearth of direct explicit testimony of members of the Cabinet about a disputed Cabinet incident, it is curious and interesting to watch the assiduous ex Judge Advocate, with the most ingenious and industrious sophistry, attempt to extract corroboration from the statements of the 2 Cabinet officers whom he has induced to speak, where in truth no corroboration can be found. After all his efforts, he is forced at last to fall back upon the single testimony of the one man without whose encouraging information, he frankly informs us, he would not have dared to come before the people, and upon whom he brings himself to believe he might safely rest his defense. That man is John A. Bingham, now, as once before, Special Assistant Judge Advocate to Joseph Holt. During the 8 years which had elapsed since their crowning achievement of hanging a woman for the murder of Abraham Lincoln, these 2 men had lived, for a considerable portion of the time, in the same city. They were together in the contest over Reconstruction and impeachment, standing in the front rank of the enemies of Johnson. They were both at the Capitol during the trial of John H. Surratt, when the ghastly reminiscences of the trial of the mother, along with 7 chained men, must have drawn the 2 military prosecutors into a most sympathetic union. And yet when, in February, 1873, Joseph Holtz sits down in Washington to write his letter of inquiry to John A. Bingham, then in the same city, he would have us believe that he had never before poured into the bosom of his old colleague his own sufferings over the frightful calumny so long poisoning the very air he breathed, never before told him his embarrassment over the difficulty to elicit evidence from Cabinet officials, never before besought his friend for his own powerful testimony on the side of his persecuted fellow official. He writes to his former assistant as though the information were now communicated for the first time, that the President and he were alone when the record was presented and the death warrant signed, that he had always been satisfied the petition was considered in a Cabinet meeting, but has hitherto been unable to obtain any evidence upon that point, and then in an artless, ingenuous manner, as if putting the question for the first time, asks his correspondent whether or not he had had a conversation with William H. Seward, Secretary of State under President Johnson, in reference to the petition, and, if so, state as nearly as you may be able to do all he said on the subject, with a like request as to Edwin M. Stanton, Secretary of War. With a diviner's skill he selects the two members of the Cabinet who are then dead, and not to disappoint him, Bingham, in a letter from Washington 6 days later, informs him that he has struck the twofold mark. With the same apparent artlessness which characterizes the letter of inquiry, this useful advocate now, as if for the first time, discloses to his long tried colleague that he did indeed have a conversation with each of the eminent men he had hit upon who are now, alas, dead. Judge Bingham is a most willing witness. He relates with great circumstantiality that, after the Military Commission had tried and sentenced the parties, he prepared the form of the petition to the President. He then gives the form thus prepared as he now recollects it, in which there are two significant mistakes. He states that he wrote it with his own hands, that General Ekin copied it, and the five signed the copy. As if all this particularity had any relevance to the question at issue, as if the point in dispute was the existence of the paper, and not its suppression at a critical moment after it was written. He affects to believe it necessary to state to his old colleague that he deemed it his duty to call the attention of Secretary Stanton to the petition, and did call his attention to it before the final action of the President. As if it were among the possibilities that the head of the War Department could in any case have overlooked so important a paper, much less that the imperious chief of this very prosecution could have been kept in ignorance 1 hour of what was done by his tools. The Special Assistant, however, at last comes to the point. After the execution, the statement to which you refer was made that President Johnson had not seen the petition for the commutation of the death sentence upon Mrs. Surratt. I afterwards called at your office, and, without notice to you of my purpose, asked for the record in the case of the assassins. It was opened and shown me, and there was then attached to it the petition, copied and signed, as hereinbefore stated. Oh, what an artless pair of correspondents! The former Special Assistant tells the former Judge Advocate how he played the detective on him, to his friend's justification, without notice of my purpose. Soon thereafter I called upon Secretaries Stanton and Seward, and asked if this petition had been presented to the President before the death sentence was by him approved, and was answered by each of those gentlemen that the petition was presented to the President, and was duly considered by him and his advisers before the death sentence upon Mrs. Surratt was approved, and that the President and the Cabinet, upon such consideration, were a unit in denying the prayer of the petition, Mr. Stanton and Mr. Seward stating that they were present. In weighing the credibility of this statement, so conclusive if true, two considerations should be borne in mind. One, that we have here not the testimony of either Seward or Stanton, but the testimony of a man who, if the paper was in fact suppressed, must have been a participant in the foul deed; for no one will believe for a moment that Joseph Holt would have dared to perpetrate if he could, or could have perpetrated if he dared, so unspeakable a wickedness without the knowledge and cooperation of his fiery leader, in the conduct of the trial. 2. If this decisive information was in the possession of Judge Bingham at so early a date as "soon after the execution," why had he not communicated it to his distressed partner while Stanton and Seward lived? He had taken pains to obtain it to meet the ugly stories that were even then circulating against the Judge Advocate. He knew it at the time of the struggle at close quarters over the petition during the Surratt trial, and he must have been cognizant of the fact that for the lack of it that officer had been forced to withdraw the allegation of a full Cabinet consideration of the petition which he had at first prompted the counsel of the United States boldly and publicly to make. After the trial the reports grew louder and louder until it was everywhere said that Andrew Johnson habitually declared that he had never seen the paper. Holt ran hither and thither collecting testimony from all available quarters. Here Holt himself, every time the buzz of this slanderous rumor reached him, Bingham, during the last 8 years, which was doubtless often, his awakened memory must have reminded him that he held in his keeping proof that this rumor was false. Why did not his former assistant even relieve his tremendous anxiety by telling him that he had evidence which would blow the calumny into the air? General Holt, in a letter in reply to Bingham's, dated at Washington the next day, which he also prints in his vindication, says: "It would have been fortunate indeed could I have had this testimony in my possession years ago." He calls its concealment a sad, sad mockery. Yes, and why was Judge Bingham willing to perpetrate such a mockery and continue the mockery until Stanton's death, and then until Seward's death, which occurred only a few months before he at last enlightened his colleague? Can the most credulous of men believe that during all these years he was guilty of such cruelty as not even to whisper such welcome intelligence into the ears of his sorely distressed brother officer? And what shall we say of William H. Seward? If that great man told Judge Bingham in 1865 what the Judge, after Seward was dead, first says he did, why had William H. Seward kept silent so many years, and had at last died and made no sign? He must have heard the charge, so infamous if false, and if Judge Bingham be believed, he must have known it to be false. He must have heard the statement of Judge Pierrepont in open court in 1867. He must have known of the President sending for the record and of the explosion thereupon in the Department of War. Why did he not at that crisis come forward with the proof of which the Judge Advocate was so dreadfully in need? The Secretary of State could not have intrenched himself behind the inviolability of proceedings of Cabinet meetings, as did the overscrupulous Attorney General, because, according to Judge Bingham, he himself had betrayed the secret long before. And why did not Judge Bingham force him to speak, or else make public his interview with him, while Seward was alive and could either affirm or contradict it? No, these two eminent lawyers, yoked together as the common mark of what they call a most atrocious slander, originating with the President of the United States, bruited about everywhere both in official and private circles, wait 8 long years, and until after the death of the head of the President's Cabinet, from whose lips one of them, at least, had heard at its very inception a solemn refutation of the black lie, before they venture to proclaim it to the world. Mr. Bingham admits in his letter that, in 1865, he desired to make the facts he had ascertained public. Why did he not make public what Seward had told him while Seward was living? He furnishes no answer to this question, and until he does, his testimony on the matter is tainted with a most reasonable suspicion. And besides, what we know of the situation of the Secretary of State at the time of the execution of Mrs. Surratt, of his subsequent career, and of his lofty character as a man, is sufficient to stamp the account of Judge Bingham as incredible. William H. Seward, one of the most distinguished statesmen of the era of the Civil War, one of the most illustrious founders of the Republican party, and one of the most trusted advisers of Abraham Lincoln, remained in the Cabinet of Andrew Johnson until the close of his administration. He united in the pardon of Mudd, Spangler, and Arnold. He stood by the President fearlessly in the dark days of the impeachment, and when the President had become the target of the daily curses of thousands of Seward's former political friends. Had he known that the accusation against General Holt was false, and at the same time heard the daily reiteration of its truth from the lips of his chief, he would not have remained an hour in the cabinet of such a monumental slanderer. So far from allowing the ceremonial restraints of cabinet rules to make him a silent accomplice in a foul falsehood, he would have proclaimed the truth, if necessary even from the steps of the Capitol. Mr. Seward, at the time of the execution of Mrs. Surratt, could have but barely recovered from the broken jaw and broken arm from which he was suffering, when he bore the savage assault of Payne, and from the grievous wounds which that mad ruffian inflicted. One of his sons was still incapacitated because of injuries from the same hand, and his wife died June 21st, 1865. It is not at all probable that in such dolorous circumstances he would be required to give close attention to a subject entirely outside of the duties of his department, and in which his personal feelings as a sufferer were so deeply involved. He said himself under oath to a Congressional committee, "Having been myself a sufferer in that business, the subject would be a delicate one for me to pursue without seeming to be overzealous or demonstrative." In spite of the 8 years' embalmed testimony of 100 Binghams, we would not believe that the uncomplaining victim of Payne voted to deny the petition of mercy. While no attempt is made to explain the silence of Seward during his lifetime, or the silence of Judge Bingham himself regarding the information he got from Seward, this willing witness does give a most singular and perplexing explanation of his long silence regarding the information he got from Stanton. He says, in the same letter: "Having ascertained the fact as stated, I then desired to make the same public, and so expressed myself to Mr. Stanton, who advised me not to do so, but to rely upon the final judgment of the people." General Holt, in a subsequent article, states that Stanton enjoined upon the Judge silence in reference to the communication. We are called upon to believe that the Secretary of War, at the very first interview with Judge Bingham, when, upon the theory of the truth of the information, there could have been no conceivable motive for its concealment, advised his inquiring friend to suppress a fact essential to the refutation of a despicable slander blotting the fair name of a brother officer. Not only this, but that the Secretary continued the injunction of silence during all the years the terrible charge was being bandied about on the lips of men to the daily torment of the poor man so cruelly assailed. As General Holt says, it was a deliberate and merciless sacrifice of me so far as he could accomplish it, and he enforced the silence up to the day of his death. But we ask what reason had the great War Minister to perpetrate so pitiless an outrage? Why, in the days of the trial of John H. Surratt, why, in the days of his stern enmity toward the President, when his removal furnished the main ground of impeachment, did he not once speak out for his slandered servant, or even unlock the sealed lips of the obedient Bingham and suffer him to tell the truth? General Holt, in 1883, on affirming in the text of his article that Messrs. Seward and Stanton declared the truth to Judge Bingham, adds the following explanatory note: "This praise was certainly due to Mr. Seward, but not in strictness to Mr. Stanton, since, on making the communication to Judge Bingham, he endeavored, and successfully, to prevent him from giving it publicity. The fear of Andrew Johnson's resentment, added to a determination on his part to leave my reputation, then under fire, from his silence, to its fate, sufficiently explain his otherwise inexplicable conduct." But does it? Is this, in truth, a sufficient explanation? Stanton, the stern War Minister, fear the resentment of Andrew Johnson? When was he taken with it? When he bearded the President in his Cabinet? When he defied him in the War Department and scattered his missive of removal to the winds? Or did he wait to begin to fear him until the President retired to private life, just escaping conviction by impeachment, and shorn of all popularity, North or South? The preposterous nature of the cause assigned casts suspicion upon the assignor himself. As to the second cause, we are at a loss to conceive why Mr. Stanton should harbor such motiveless malignity against the reputation of his former colleague, then his pliant subordinate, and always his friend. We need, in this regard, an explanation of the explanation. If it be true, it settles the character of Stanton for all time. But it appears in the words of General Holt that while he, Stanton, lived, this enforced silence was scrupulously obeyed. Again we ask, why? Why should Bingham have obeyed the advice, even if given by Stanton so long before? Why should the associate of Holt in the prosecution and execution of Mrs. Surratt have ministered to the malignity of Stanton, scrupulously obeyed his base injunction, and never even told his beloved fellow laborer on the field of courts martial that he possessed such secret, sacred testimonials in his favor? The General gives us no explanation of this inexplicable conduct. Surely, the undaunted Bingham, who as manager on the impeachment trial, so clawed the character of the arraigned President, could have had no fear of the resentment of Andrew Johnson. And unless the masterful Stanton held some secret back to feather his advice, or lend weight to his injunction of silence, we see no reason why the fear of Stanton should have closed the lips of the voluble Special Judge Advocate. He surely could not have joined in the fine irony of the Secretary, that it would be better for their mutual friend, though under fire, to rely on the judgment of the people. But another and a final explanation is necessary. The great War Minister died in December, 1869. Holt more than hints that Providence shortened his life so that he should no longer precipitate so pitiless an outrage as keeping Bingham's mouth shut. Why, then, do we hear nothing from Judge Bingham for 3 years more? In the words of Holt, after the Secretary had, amid the world's funeral pomp, gone down into his sepulchre, the truth came up out of the grave to which he had consigned it, and was resurrected and openly announced by Judge Bingham. But why was the resurrection delayed until February, 1873? He does not tell us. Why should the buzz of this slanderous rumor, to use Holt's own words, sadly recall to him that, though holding that proof, he was not yet privileged to divulge it? There is no answer to this, none. The scrupulosity of Bingham did not end with the providential taking off of Stanton, but prolonged its reverential obedience to the advice of the dead, until his great colleague was also summoned from the scene. Such resurrected truth, like the suggested letter of Speed to be used only after poor Holt's death, seems doubly obnoxious to the latter's own common sense remark. Thus strangely withheld from the public, it would not, when it appeared, be credited. On the whole, it is exceedingly doubtful whether Judge Bingham's testimony does not do more harm than good to General Holt's case. It is the testimony of an accomplice, if the charge it is meant to refute is true. Its subject matter is hearsay, withheld so long as the direct evidence was attainable, for no good reason, or for a reason assigned which will not stand a moment's examination. This interchange of letters between two associates in infamy, if infamy there were, the one applying for and the other disclosing ostensibly for the first time, at so late a day, decisive information, which in the ordinary course of things the one must have asked for or the other revealed, and both talked over from the beginning, wears upon the face all the features of a collusive correspondence. No one acquainted with the facts can be induced to credit what both these men state upon the threshold of their correspondence, and upon the truth of which their credibility is staked for all time, that, if two such conversations with Judge Bingham actually took place, this co-victim of a common charge would ever have withheld all knowledge of such important testimony from his brother in affliction for 8 years. and until the lips of his two eminent interlocutors, whose confirmation would have at once and forever crushed the calumny, were closed in death. And with this incontrovertible assertion we dismiss John A. Bingham to keep company with Richard Montgomery and Sanford Conover, two witnesses who were once the subjects of his own fervid eulogy. Another aspect of the case must for a moment detain us. Under the admitted fact that the President approved the death sentence on Wednesday, July 5th, it is by no means clear how we are to find room for this supposed Cabinet meeting. The natural construction of Bingham's letter would lead us to believe that the Cabinet meeting, which the two secretaries are said to have described, was a regular consultation between the President and his advisors, held before the confidential interview at which the President approved the death sentence, and that the entire Cabinet voted on the question raised by the petition because it was a unit in denying the prayer. This is but another version of the full Cabinet of Judge Pierrepont's first statement, and forcibly suggests that the two have an identical origin, at first withdrawn under compulsion while Seward lived, at last brought forward again after his death. And every one on such construction would expect to hear the voices of McCulloch, Wells, and Dennison, still living in 1873, and accessible to the ex-Judge Advocate. He states in his refutation that he had satisfactory reasons for believing that they were not there, but he could not have gathered those reasons from Judge Bingham or his letter, which really is only consistent with the presence of some, if not all, of the three, and it is naturally to be inferred he got them from the ex-members themselves in letters repudiating all knowledge of the petition, letters he takes care not to publish. Again, the Cabinet meeting described in Judge Bingham's letter cannot be made to square with the meeting described in the letter of Judge Harlan. The former was a regular Cabinet meeting. The latter was an informal discussion by a few members of the Cabinet. At the one the petition was duly considered; at the other neither record nor petition was present. At the one a formal vote was taken upon the question as to Mrs. Surratt's case; at the latter her case was never submitted to a formal vote. But, not to dwell further on dispensable points, it is enough to say that any Cabinet meeting whatever, for the consideration of the petition, held before the President's approval of the death sentence, is, on the admitted facts of the case, an impossibility. Indeed, Holt himself, when driven to the question, does not claim that there was. The record was in the custody of the Judge Advocate from the 30th of June until that officer carried it to the President on the 5th of July, and during that interval the President was sick abed. It was General Holt, as he himself states, who first drew his attention to the recommendation, and the President then and there read it in his presence. And this was at the confidential interview on Wednesday, July 5th. There could have been no meeting of the President and his Cabinet at which the record and petition were present and discussed before the approval of the death sentence, which confessedly was done at the confidential interview. When this impossibility was pointed out by Andrew Johnson, General Holt in his refutation, with great show of indignation, denounces such an argument as intensely disingenuous. While conceding at once that from the adjournment of the Commission to the 5th of July the President had been sick in bed and had, of course, had no opportunity of conferring with any members of his Cabinet, he proceeds to show what his idea of intense ingenuousness is, by claiming that what Messrs. Seward and Stanton, of Bingham's letter, clearly meant was that before the President had finally and definitely approved the sentences in question, the recommendation to mercy had been considered by him and his advisers in Cabinet meeting, and therefore such a meeting might have been held after the signature to the death warrant, say on Wednesday afternoon, 5th, or on Thursday the 6th. And he now, once again, as in the days of the Surratt trial, abandons all idea of a full or regular Cabinet meeting, and endeavors with the most transparent sophistry to identify the informal discussion of Judge Harlan's letter with the Cabinet council of Judge Bingham. But alas, for the ingenuous General! Circumstances are too strong for him, for there is no more room for a Cabinet meeting, formal or informal, to do what Judge Bingham's informants are said to relate, i.e., consider and then vote upon the petition after the confidential interview than before. It is agreed on all hands that the President approved of the death sentence on Wednesday at the confidential interview between Holt and himself, and at that very time, and by the same warrant, appointed Friday the 7th for the executions. The whole matter was begun and ended in an hour. There was neither opportunity, nor, if there had been, use to hold a Cabinet consultation upon the question of commutation after that. The President had reviewed the record, and, without consultation with any human being but Holt, put his name to the death warrant. Why consult his confidential advisers after he had decided the whole matter? Holt himself says that at this private interview it was not he, but Andrew Johnson, who had fully made up his mind that Mrs. Surratt must be put to death; that the President needed no urging or advice on that subject; that he inveighed against the women of the South with a ferocity which reminds us of the loyal Bingham himself. Holt says that the President himself, without a suggestion from him, was prompt and decided as to when the execution should take place, and in the same spirit, too, in which he subsequently suspended the writ of habeas corpus, he fixed the Friday following. Why call in his advisers after he had, with the approval of his judgment and his conscience, put his hand to the work of blood? Besides, if he needed such a supererogatory endorsement of his advisers, there was no time to get it. The record, with the death warrant, went directly to the Adjutant General's office that very Wednesday. Holt cannot remember whether he took it or not, nor can the Adjutant General remember when or how he received it. But this is of no consequence. The order for the execution was drawn on that day, the necessary copies made that day. It was promulgated on the morning of Thursday the 6th, and on that day at noon, the warrant for her death, within 24 hours, was read to the fainting woman in her cell. All day long on the 6th, the White House was besieged by her friends, her priests, and her daughter, to obtain a reprieve. The guardians of the President had no time to hold Cabinet consultations over foregone dooms of death. They were too busy intercepting verbal prayers for mercy, holding shut the doors of the President's private room, sending away all petitioners for a few more hours' life to the merciful Judge Advocate, making sure that there should be 4 pine coffins and 4 newly dug graves, and that the habeas corpus should not leave one empty. Hold a Cabinet meeting after the President had signed the bloody warrant, and Stanton had once clutched it? Reopen the perilous question to hear Wells and Dennison and McCulloch and Seward, to say nothing of Harlan and Speed and Stanton, discuss a petition addressed to the President, who had already denied it. 5 members of our court have been suborned by their feelings to swerve from their duty. We run no more risks of soft-hearted gallantry this time amid the members of the Cabinet. Let the funeral games begin. The ex-Judge Advocate insists that the signature to the death warrant was a matter of very little moment. The President could withdraw it at any time. But would he have us believe that after the President had dispatched such a fatal missive to the officer whose sole duty, with regard to it, consisted in the promulgation of an order for its execution within 24 hours, such action was simply provisional, and, according to usage, still subject to rescission by a Cabinet vote? Desperate indeed must be the necessities of a defense which drive the defendant on the forlorn hope of identifying a Cabinet meeting, voting as a unit to deny a petition for clemency, before the death warrant was approved, with a Cabinet discussion of the petition after the death warrant, fixing the execution on the next day but one, had been signed by the President, who is represented as urgent and eager at the moment of his signature to exact in the shortest time the extremest penalty, on the ground that the latter was held before the theoretical animus revocandi of the Executive had become technically inoperative with the last sigh of the condemned. It has been suggested by one of his subordinate officers that the Secretary of War, having seen the petition so soon as the record came to his department, it is inconceivable that at some moment between the 30th and the 7th the matter should not have been discussed by him with the President. Of course, there can be no doubt that Stanton knew all about the recommendation, but, and this obvious answer seems to have altogether escaped the attention of his friend, If the paper was in fact suppressed, it was suppressed with Stanton's own knowledge. Indeed, his must have been the master hand. He it was who kept the late Vice President up to the mark of severity as long as the bloody humor lasted. He was the sovereign, and Bingham and Holt but his vassals. Everybody will give them the credit of not having dared to dream of suppression without the electrifying nod of their imperious lord. And from the long silence of one, if not both, of his slaves, it would appear that he not only directed the suppression of the paper, but was too proud to deny, or suffer his minions to deny it to his dying day. End of chapter 4. The Judicial Murder of Mary E. Surratt, by David Miller DeWitt. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Part 2, The Vindication. Chapter 5, Andrew Johnson signs another death warrant. Let us turn from the case made by General Holt, which on a cursory inspection seems so strong, but the seeming strength of which, on a closer scrutiny, dissipates itself among such perplexing questions, and lands us at last in the enjoined silence of Stanton, to the first public, authoritative charge made by the ex-President. It appeared November 12, 1873, in the same newspaper which had published General Holt's vindication, to which it was a reply. For it must be remembered that it was Joseph Holt, for 8 years the accused, and not Andrew Johnson, for 8 years the accuser, at the bar of rumor, who first threw down his gage in the public arena, defying his secret antagonist to come forth. The gallant knight chose his own good time, and at last, surrounded with sponsors both clerical and martial, with banners flying and a most sonorous peal of trumpets, he burst into the lists, as though he would fain hope by noise and show to overawe his dreaded adversary into submissive silence. His thunders availed nothing. His glove had no longer reached the ground than it was taken up. Let us hear the plain, straightforward statement of Andrew Johnson. There are no mysteries to unravel, no explanations to explain. The findings and sentences of the court were submitted on the 5th of July, he and I being alone, were then and there approved by the Executive, and taken by the Judge Advocate General to the War Department, where on the same afternoon the order to carry them into effect was issued. Mr. Speed doubtless saw the record, but it must have been in the Department of War, and not in the Executive Office." After thus quietly disposing of Mr. Speed's evidence, he proceeds: "The record of the court was submitted to me by Judge Holt in the afternoon of the 5th day of July, 1865. Instead of entering the Executive Mansion in the usual way, he gained admission by the private or family entrance to the Executive Office. The examination of the papers took place in the library, and he and I, alone, were present. The sentences of the court in the cases of Herold, Atzerodt, and Payne were considered in the order named, and then the sentence in the case of Mrs. Surratt. In acting upon her case, no recommendation for a commutation of her punishment was mentioned or submitted to me." He then states that the question of sex was discussed alone, Holt insisting upon carrying out the sentence without discriminating as to sex; that a woman unsexed was worse than a man; that too many females had abetted traitors during the war; and that there was a necessity an example should be made. He was not only in favor of the approval of the sentence, but its execution on the earliest practicable day. Upon the termination of our consultation, Judge Holt wrote the order approving the sentences of the court. I affixed my name to it, and rolling up the papers, he took his leave, carrying the record with him, and departing as he had come, through the family or private entrance." And there we must leave him. True, he rejoined in December in another very long article, contributed to the same newspaper, in which he endeavored to break the force of several points made in Johnson's answer, and dwelt with much insistence on the abstention of the President from making any open charge against him, and on his adversary's present silence with regard to General Mussey's letter. But there is nothing new in the way of testimony, except two sympathizing letters from Generals Ekin and Hunter, respectively, the former of which might be construed by the uncharitable as evidence that General Holt, at the time of the execution, was already forestalling anticipated accusation by defending himself in private to his friends. The latter is a tribute from the grim President of the Military Commission to the Judge Advocate's tenderness to the prisoners before that body, of which the printed record of the trial affords such striking illustrations. This lengthy refutation, as it was entitled, upon the whole added little, if any, strength to the vindication, his accuser, on his side, resting content with his one single explicit public utterance, paid no attention to it. And when, at the present hour, we calmly survey the relative standing, the position, the character and career of the two combatants, the circumstances surrounding the momentous confidential interview, the silent testimony of the record with the significant twist of the death warrant, the nature of the accusation, the mysteries enveloping the belated defense, the probable motives actuating each, the thirst for blood which for a time maddened the leading spirits of the War Department, the passivity of Johnson for the few weeks after his sudden and somber inauguration, and for the same period the wild and reckless predominance of Stanton. What valid reason exists why we should discredit or even suspect for a moment the veracity of the ex-President? Andrew Johnson looms up in history a very different figure from the one discerned by his enemies, both North and South, amid the passions of his epoch. He was no inebriate, as he was stigmatized because of the unfortunate incident at his inauguration as Vice President. He was no weak, frightened tool, as he appeared to be at the bloody crisis of his accession to the Presidency. He was no apostate from his section, as he was cursed by the South for being at the breaking out of the war. He was no traitor to the North, as he was denounced by the impeachers for the mere endeavor to carry out the Reconstruction policy of his lamented predecessor. He was not the garrulous fool he was called in ridicule when he swung around the circle. He is now recognized, when his career is reviewed as a whole, as a man temperate in his habits, firm, self-willed, and honest; as a statesman, intelligent though uncultured, sometimes profound and always sincere; and as a Union-loving, non-sectional, earnest patriot. His impeachment is looked back upon by the whole country with shame. His impeachers are already themselves both impeached and convicted at the bar of history. In sober truth, so unique and perfect a triumph never capped and completed the career of a Roman warrior or modern ruler of men, as when, but little more than a year after his reply to General Holt, the ex-President, once again the chosen representative of that State whose rebellious people he had coerced with an iron hand as military governor during the Civil War, took his seat in that body, before which he had been arraigned, on the impeachment of the House of Representatives, and had escaped conviction by but a single vote. With the words of Holt's denunciation still fresh in their remembrance, the citizens of Washington loaded the desk of the retributive Senator with flowers; and when he advanced, amidst so many colleagues who had condemned him as judges, to take the oath of office, and again when, a few days later, his voice, which had before been heard pleading for the imperiled Union, was from the same place once more heard pleading for the imperiled Constitution, the crowded galleries and corridors gave him a conquering hero's welcome. When in the following summer he died, his body was followed to its grave in the mountains by what it is hardly an exaggeration to call the whole people of his State. When Congress reassembled, the Senate and the House clothed themselves with crape. One of his former judges, who had voted him guilty of high crimes and misdemeanors, Morton, of Indiana, thus spoke of him in the Senate: "In every position in life he showed himself to be a man of ability and courage, and I believe it proper to say of Andrew Johnson that his honesty has never been suspected, that the smell of corruption was never upon his garments." The same Senator related that when Johnson, as the newly appointed military governor, arrived in Nashville, he was threatened with assassination on the streets and in the public assemblies, but he went on the streets, he defied these dangers, he went into public assemblies, and on one occasion went into a public meeting, drew his pistol, laid it on the desk before him, and said, "I have been told that I should be assassinated if I came here. If that is to be done, then it is the first business in order, and let that be attended to." No attempt having been made, he said, "I conclude the danger has passed by," and then proceeded to make his speech. Again the Senator said, "After I had voted for his impeachment and met him accidentally, he wore the same kindly smile as before, and offered me his hand. I thought that showed nobility of soul. There were not many men who could have done that." The man of whom two such incidents could be truthfully related could never have invented so foul a charge against an innocent subordinate. A Senator from a neighboring State, McCreary, on the same mournful occasion, said of him, "When he went to Greenville he was a stranger and a tailor's kit. His thimbles and his needles were probably the sum total of his earthly possessions. At his death, the hills and the valleys and the mountains and the rivers sent forth their thousands to testify to the general grief at the irreparable loss. I honor him for that manly courage which sustained him on every occasion, and which never quailed in presence of opposition, no matter how imposing. I honor him for that independence of soul which had no scorn for the lowly and no cringing adulation for the exalted. I honor him for that sterling integrity which was beyond the reach of temptation, and which at the close of his public service left no blot, no stain upon his escutcheon. I honor him for that magnanimity which, after the war cloud had passed and the elements had settled, would have brought every citizen under the radiant arch of the bow of peace and pardon." Another Senator, Paddock of Nebraska, gave utterance to the following unchallenged statement: "I believe, sir, notwithstanding the fact that a painful chapter relating to the official acts of Andrew Johnson was made in this very chamber, that no Senator here present will refuse to-day to join me in the declaration that he was essentially an honest man, I, sir, a patriot in the fullest sense of the term." Yet another, Bogey of Missouri, said, "His last election to a seat on this floor as Senator was the work of his own hands, brought about by his own indomitable will and pluck, the reward of a long and terrible contest, continuing for 7 years, unsuccessful for a time, and appearing to all the world besides himself as utterly hopeless. Nevertheless, finally, he was triumphant. From what I have learned from those who are familiar with this, his last contest, he exhibited more openly his true and peculiar nature than at any other period of his life, which was to fight with all his might and all his ability, asking no quarter and granting none; and although, like bloody Richard, now and then unhorsed, still to fight and never surrender until the victory perched upon his banner." Senator Bayard said, "Friend or foe alike must admit his steady, unshaken love of country, his constant industry, his simple integrity and honesty, his courage of conviction that never faltered." Truly, the solemn word of a man of whom such things can be said is no light thing, to be thrust aside by windy abuse or vociferous denial. Now, what conceivable motive had such a man, seated in the chair of the chief magistracy of the Republic, surrounded by cabinet officers who had been the advisers of his predecessor, to invent, in the first place, so horrible a story as that a friendly subordinate officer had deliberately, in a case of life and death, suppressed so vital a document? For it is contradictory of historical fact that he never openly made the charge until the year 1873. This may be true of the period from about the time of the execution up to the disclosures of the John H. Surratt trial in 1867. But our review of the incidents of that trial, which General Holt in his refutation seemed to have totally forgotten, proves beyond the possibility of controversy that the President then first thought himself driven to inspect the record to ascertain the existence of such a paper, and then first, after the discovery that there was in fact a recommendation, at once and at all times afterwards, openly asserted that he had not seen it or read it. Every one around him knew that he so said. Stanton, his great enemy, Seward, his great friend, knew it. Bingham, at the very beginning, when Stanton forbade him to refute it; Bingham, when Butler pierced his shield in the House of Representatives; and Bingham, when at the bar of the Senate as manager of the impeachment he belabored his old time commander in chief, knew it. Holt, when he delivered his contradiction through Judge Pierrepont to the Surratt jury, and when he felt the shadows darkening over his head because of the inexplicable conduct of the great War Minister in perpetuating the pitiless outrage, knew it, and recognized the President of the United States as the responsible author of the tremendous accusation. If Holt is to be credited, the President must have known that 4 at least of his confidential advisers stood ready to shatter the baseless calumny. What conceivable motive, we ask again, to invent such a story, so easy of refutation, so ruinous to himself, if refuted? The necessity to make some reply to this pressing question seems to have driven both General Holt himself and his defenders into the maintenance of the most absurd, antagonistic, and untenable positions. Holt's theory on this subject in his refutation is even ingenious in its absurdity. He would have us believe that when Johnson originally fabricated the calumny, "he had not yet broken with the Republican party, and was doubtless, in his heart at least, a candidate for re-election," of course by that party. If this is true, then the fabrication was made before the fall of 1865, for by that time the President was in full swing of opposition to the men who had elected him Vice President. During this brief transitory period, according to Holt, Johnson discovered that the hostility of the Catholics, especially, as may be inferred, those of the Republican party, on account of his signature to the death warrant of Mrs. Surratt, would blast this otherwise felicitous prospect. Accordingly, to abate this uncomfortable hostility, this Republican candidate concocted the vile slander, and set it secretly and anonymously circulating among his friends and followers, even his greed for a re-election not being strong enough to give full effect to his cowardly policy by openly clearing his own skirts. Could the fatuity of folly farther go? The dream of Andrew Johnson as a Republican candidate for President had ceased to be possible even before the execution of Mrs. Surratt. The Catholics who could be conciliated by any such story might be numbered on Johnson's fingers, and the undisguised signature to the death warrant could be obliterated by no plea of abatement which the petitioner dared not avow. On the other hand, the other suggestion put forward, if not by Holt himself, by several of his defenders, viz., that the President propagated the lie to curry favor with the South in the hope to be elected to the Presidency, has the one merit of being in direct antagonism to the foregoing theory, but nevertheless is yet more flimsy and preposterous. At the time he invented the story, if invention it was, as Holt appears to have perceived, the road to the Presidency was to curry favor with the North and not with the downtrodden South, and after Johnson had escaped conviction and removal by but one vote, and had retired from office, execrated by the North and distrusted even yet by the South, the chance of the Presidency for such a character as he was popularly considered then, especially by truckling to the discredited South, could only look fair in the imagination of a lunatic. No Southern man has seriously thought of being, or has been seriously thought of, as a candidate for President of either political party since the termination of the war, let alone the one Southerner reputed to have been false alternately to both parties and both sections. Besides, Andrew Johnson never apologized for his appointment of the Military Commission, for his approval of its judgment, or for his signature to the death warrant. He pardoned Dr. Mudd on the very eve of the impeachment trial, and he pardoned the 2 remaining prisoners just before he went out of office, and he may therefore be held to have thus signified his reawakened reverence for constitutional rights as expounded in the Milligan decision. But in no other way did he ever acknowledge that in taking the life of Mary E. Surratt he had done wrong. On the contrary, he defended his action in his answer of 1873, and he justified his denial of the habeas corpus, which the ex-Judge Advocate had the exquisite effrontery to cast up against him. That a President in his situation could cherish aspirations, or hope of re-election, based on such a phantom foundation as the whining plea that he would have commuted the unlawful sentence of a woman, hung by his command, to imprisonment for life, had he been permitted to see the petition of 5 of her judges, such an imputation can only be made by men mad enough to believe him to have been the accomplice of Booth and Atzerodt. Finally, let us sternly put the question: what right has Holt to ask us, on the word of himself and his associates, to reject the testimony of Andrew Johnson, who at the best was their accomplice or their tool? He and his associates, demanded the life of Atzerodt for barely imagining the death of so precious a Vice President. He and his associates hounded the woman to the scaffold, welcoming with delight the stories of spies, informers, personal enemies, false friends against her, and meeting with contumely and violence the least scrap of testimony in her favor. He suppressed the diary. Why may he not have been bad enough to suppress the recommendation? Two of the same band of woman stranglers kept back from the President the petition for mercy which wailed out from the lips of the stricken daughter. Why should he not have kept back the timorous suggestion of 5 officers who were so soft-hearted as to discriminate as to sex? His fate will be, and therein equal and exact justice will be done him, to go down through the ages, stealing away in the dusk of the evening from the private entrance to the White House, bearing the fatal missive, the last feeble hope of the trembling widow crushed in his furtive hand. End of chapter 5. The Judicial Murder of Mary E. Surratt, by David Miller DeWitt. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Part 2, The Vindication. Chapter 6, Conclusion. That the petition for commutation was a device of the triumvirate of prosecutors to secure the coveted death sentence, employed in reliance upon the temporary ascendancy of the chief of the three over the beleaguered President, and upon the momentary pliability, heedlessness, or it may be semi-stupefaction of the successor of the murdered Lincoln to smother the offensive prayer. Such a hypothesis alone seems adequate in any degree to reconcile the apparent contradictions, clear up the perplexities, and solve the mysteries which hang around this dark affair. It furnishes the only rational answer to the else insoluble question, how it happened that a court, a majority of whose members had the inclination and the power to lower the punishment of the solitary woman before them to lifelong imprisonment, as the court did with the 3 men who were tried with her and convicted of the same crime, did nevertheless, by at least a 2/3 vote, condemn her to die by the rope. It lights up the else inscrutable prohibition by Stanton of a public exculpation of his subordinate officer, softened by the sardonic admission to rely for justification on the final judgment of the people. A source of glorification, rather, it should be, that no maudlin pity for a woman had been suffered to intercept the death stroke of a righteous vengeance. It accounts for the scrupulous obedience of Bingham, not only until Stanton's death, but 3 years after, until Seward also had gone. Stanton knew the petition had been suppressed, or made invisible; Seward that the petition had never been before the Cabinet. It throws a glimmer, faint it is true, on the shameful attitude of Speed, 8 years after the death of Johnson, still shutting his ears to the repeated appeals of his agonized friend, and still falling back on his propriety. According to Judge Harlan, the whole record had been examined by the Attorney General as well as the Secretary of War. Speed, too, under the spell of Stanton, may have fingered the obnoxious paper, which might nip the bloody consummate flower of his common law of war. It furnishes the only plausible reason why such an historic document did not appear in the published official record of the proceedings of the Military Commission in November, 1865, or in the reports of the Judge Advocate, first to the President and second to the Congress. It illumines with a baleful light the atmosphere of sinister secrecy in which this adjunct to the record, for no lawful reason, has been enshrouded, the mysterious incidents at the Surratt trial, such as the tardy and reluctant production, the faltering and imperfect exhibition, and the hasty withdrawal of the roll of papers, the 2 statements of Mr. Pierpont, the shrinking of the full Cabinet meeting into a confidential interview, until after Seward's death, and the singularly equivocal language that the petition was "before the President" when he signed the warrant. And finally, when it is considered that the suppression of the paper was not the overt act of any one man, but the result of a strictly formal presentation of the record on the part of the Judge Advocate, aided, it may be, by a timely sleight of hand in writing the order of approval, and of a blind carelessness on the part of the President in the examination of the papers. This hypothesis goes far to explain the reluctance of General Holt to rest his defense on his own evidence of the confidential interview, his eager grasping after Cabinet corroboration, and the abstention of both Judge Advocate and President from taking official action upon the charge, the one for vindication, the other for punishment. And so the history of this murder of a woman by the forms of military rule slowly unrolls itself to disclose, as its appropriate finis, the writer of the death warrant struggling in the meshes of his own fraud. The draftsman of this unaddressed petition for commutation, after waiting 8 years for death to clear the way, comes to the help of his old colleague, only to be caught in the same net. The entangled twain call up the sullen shade of their departed master, and force him to father the trick he fain would have scorned. These three are the men who, when the summary methods of martial law would else have failed to crush out entirely the life of their victim, contrived to attain their bloody end by cool and deliberate chicanery. The other actors on the scene may plead the madness of the time. For these three no such plea is open. They superadded to the common madness of the time the particular malice of the felon. Upon their three heads should descend the full weight of criminal turpitude involved in this most unnatural execution. They sat upon the thrones of power. They dragged a woman from her humble roof and thrust her into a dungeon. They chose 9 soldiers to try her for the murder of their commander in chief. They chained her to the bar along with 7 men. They baited her for weeks with their Montgomerys and Conovers, their Weichmans and Lloyds, the spawn of their bureau, dragooned by terror or suborned by hope. They shouted into the ears of the court appeal on appeal for her head, and when at last 5 of their chosen sons sickened at the task, and shrank from shedding a woman's blood, they procured the death sentence by a trick. They forged the death warrant by another. They turned thimble riggers under the very shadow of the gallows. They cheated their own court. They cheated their own president. They cheated the very executioner. They sneaked a woman into the arms of death by sleight of hand. They played their confidence game with the king of terrors. They managed to hide the cheat from the country until they quarreled with their new commander in chief. Then ensued an interval of ambiguous mutterings, dark equivocations, private accusation, private defenses. From one side, "I never saw the paper." From the other, "It was right before his eyes." The twin ex-judge advocates at length brace each other up to the sticking point and venture on an appeal to the public. The ex-president, thus driven at bay, fulminates the secret infamy in all its foul extent to the whole world. Thereupon great Nemesis finds her opportunity, and makes these once high-placed, invulnerable woman-slayers the sport of her mighty hands. Every one, as if coerced by some magical power, comes at last to act as though he were afraid of the other, and willing or unwilling contrives to show how profoundly base the others are. Stanton slinks mysteriously into the shadow of death, refusing to cut his co-conspirator down from the gibbet where the dreaded Johnson has swung him. Bingham, standing like an Indian with a single female scalp bleeding from his girdle, presses his finger to his lips until Stanton and Seward die. Speed, with the obnoxious petition pressed again and again to his nostrils, feebly yet persistently refuses to open his mouth. Holt pictures the dead Johnson exulting even in hell over the silence of his old Attorney General; blasts the character of Stanton by ascribing his injunction of silence to a motive the most diabolic, and, unconscious seemingly that he does it, at the same time ruins the credit of Bingham by extolling his scrupulous obedience to such an infernal command. Johnson unwittingly proclaims the pardon of the slain woman in his anxiety to show that he signed her death warrant through ignorance, forced upon him by the ineffable depravity of the men in whom he was compelled to trust. This controversy over the petition of clemency was the only thing needed to round out and decorate the entire, complete, and perfect iniquity of the whole drama. It is immaterial and indifferent to history where the truth lies between these combatants in so unsavory a strife. Each one tears off the burning brand of shame, not to extinguish it, but to pass it on to his colleague. If we credit Holt, it is difficult to conceive the malignity of soul of Andrew Johnson, who could invent so foul a charge; the meanness of spirit of Edwin M. Stanton, who, knowing its blackness, could forbid the promulgation of the truth; the cowardly silence of John A. Bingham, whose lips the death of the dreaded Stanton alone could unclose. If we credit Johnson, then in all the crowded catalogue of inquisitors, persecutors, cruel or pettifogging prosecuting officers, devil's advocates, and murderous Septembricers, there is not one who would not spurn with profane emphasis association with Holt or Bingham or Stanton. As the choicest specimen in this shower of accusations and counter accusations, listen to the tender hearted ex Judge Advocate of 1873, once the stony head of the death dealing bureau, rebuking Andrew Johnson for his cold blooded cruelty. "I would have shuddered to propose the brief period of 2 days within which the sentences should be executed, for with all the mountain of guilt weighing on the heads of those convicted culprits, I still recognize them as human beings, with souls to be saved or lost, and could not have thought for a moment of hurrying them into the eternal world, as cattle are driven to the slaughter pen, without a care for their future." Listen to the former expounder of the common law of war, before the Military Commission, as he arraigns the ex President for his disregard of the writ of habeas corpus. "The object of which was, and the effect of which would have been, had it been obeyed, to delay the execution of Mrs. Surratt at least until the questions of law raised had been decided by the civil courts of the district. Yet this writ was, by the express order of the President, rendered inoperative. And so, under this presidential mandate, the execution proceeded. But for his direct intervention and defiant action on the writ, whatever might have been the final result, it is perfectly apparent her life would not have then been taken." Once more, hear J. Holt, the Recorder of the Commission. "As Chief Magistrate he was, under the Constitution," hear him, "the depository of the nation's clemency and mercy to the condemned, and a pressing responsibility rested upon him as such to hear the victims of the law before he struck them down." The italics are his who wrote out the death warrant. Did he do this? On the contrary, he gave a peremptory order to admit nobody seeking to make an appeal in behalf of the prisoners, saying that he would "see no one on this business." He closed his door, his ears, and his heart against every appeal for mercy in her behalf, and hurried this hapless woman almost unshrived to the gallows. What a picture is this! The minion of Stanton, the colleague of Bingham, the tutor of Weichman, the tutor of Lloyd, the procurer of the death warrant, weeping over the empty grave in the arsenal, which, after his master's relentless watch was over, had at length given up its dead. Here we are forced to stop. After such an exhibition we can linger no longer over this miserable scramble to shirk responsibility. Its only consequence of historic importance, after all, is the light it casts upon the memory of the sacrificial victim. Out of the cloud of mutual vituperation which covers the men who among them, somehow, compassed her slaughter, her innocence rises clearer and clearer, like the images of retribution from the foul fumes of the witch's cauldron. Her vindication must be held to be final, complete, and unassailable. When John A. Bingham is anxious to acquaint the country that he drafted a petition to save her life; when J. Holt pretends to weep for her; when Andrew Johnson is forced, by the inexorable pressure of events, to confess that when he signed her death warrant he knew not what he did. As we let the curtain fall at the close of this dark and shameful tragedy, let us endeavor to anticipate the verdict of history. The execution of Mary E. Surratt is the foulest blot on the history of the United States of America. It was a violation of the most sacred provisions of that Constitution whose enforcement was the vaunted purpose of the war. It was a violation of the fundamental forms and principles of criminal jurisprudence centuries older than the Constitution. It was a violation of that even handed justice which is said to rule in the armies of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. It was a violation of those chivalrous impulses which spring unbidden to the manly breast in the presence of woman. It was a violation of the benign precepts of Jesus, which enjoin tenderness to the fatherless and the widow. It was a violation of the magnanimity of the brave soldier, which scorns to wound the weak, the fallen, and the helpless. It was a violation of even the common instincts of fairness, which subsist as a matter of course between man and man. It was unconstitutional. It was illegal. It was unjust. It was inhumane. It was unholy. It was pusillanimous. It was mean. And it was each and all of these in the highest or lowest degree. It resembles the acts of savages, and not the deeds of civilized men. The annals of modern times will be searched in vain to furnish its parallel. Execrations rise to our lips as we read in the pages of Macaulay of the hanging of Alice Lisle and the burning of Elizabeth Gaunt. But Alice Lisle and Elizabeth Gaunt were indicted by grand juries, tried by petit juries, found guilty, and sentenced in strict accordance with criminal procedure. The forms of law which the bigoted James, and even the infamous Jeffrey, were careful to observe, were swept aside by Holt and Bingham and Stanton with a sneer. We turn aside with sickening horror from the recital of the murderous orgies of the terrorists of the French Revolution, shedding the blood of the young, the tender, the beautiful, the brave. But the terrorists of France could plead the excuse that they were driven to madness by the thought that the invading hosts encompassing the new born Republic were drawing nearer and nearer every hour with vengeance and counter revolution perched upon their banners, and a merciful destiny granted them the grace to expiate their bloody deeds on the same scaffold as their victims. But in the case of Marie Surratt, not a single redeeming feature relieves the deep damnation of her taking off. Alas, alas! Right in the center of the glory which beams from the triumph of the Union and Emancipation, there hangs a dark figure, casting an eclipsing shadow, ever widening, ever deepening, in the eyes of all the coming generations of the just. End of the Judicial Murder of Marie Surratt, by David Miller DeWitt.